Labyrinth Deluxe. Several pierced by swords and corpses lie near the columns. There was a large dent on the column. The man in the helmet holds his head and says that he thought everything would be easier, and then wonders if he has always been so strong. He raises his head a little and wonders if maybe this body is too weak. He says that Deluxe rules this labyrinth. In front of him stands a minotaur with an axe in his hand. The minotaur breathes loudly and steam comes out of his nostrils. The protagonist says that if he cannot kill him, he will die himself. He stands up with a sword in his hand. With a sword and shield, he stands opposite the minotaur. Deluxe opens his mouth wide. The protagonist puts his shield forward and runs towards the enemy. The minotaur swings an axe at the main character. He makes an attack on the protagonist, and he blocks the blow with a shield. The protagonist is pushed away due to the force of the enemy's blow. The protagonist blocks another blow. He throws away his shield, which has a large crack in it. Shrouded in golden energy, the main character runs to Deluxe. Surprise can be seen on the minotaur's face, and the protagonist almost reached him. Channels of wind circulate around the protagonist. He strikes Deluxe with his sword. The minotaur screams loudly due to pain. The axe falls to the ground. The protagonist with a bloody sword stands in front of a defeated enemy. Deluxe lies in a pool of blood. The protagonist with the bloody helmet says that he still has the same weaknesses. He thought that, unlike other minotaurs, Deluxe's heart was located on the right side of his chest. The protagonist looks at the bones lying near the candles and says that, however, these guys did not know. He thought that their attacks were aimed at the left side, where, according to them, the heart should be, so they died. A man attacks the Necromancer's chest with a spear. Deluxe makes a cutting blow to the man. The protagonist asks how he knows about this, and then adds that he killed him 1,000 times. He turns and says that not far from this place is what Deluxe guarded so carefully. The main character walks among many skulls. He stops because of something. He stands near a huge gate with a fresco on it. A bright light shines at the protagonist. He opens the gate. He goes inside the room. Illuminated by bright light, the protagonist says that he knew it and everything here is as he thought. In front of it are golden mountains with many boxes and chests filled with treasures. The protagonist approaches the throne on which lies the dagger. He sits on the throne and is enveloped in green energy. He holds a dagger in his hand and says that even the dagger is familiar to him, and then adds that it is in the game Black Ring of Banta. Green streams of energy emanate from the main character, and he says, complete absurdity. A blonde man with a plate in his hands walks between people sitting at the bar and at the table. A man with gray hair asks a man in a black shirt if he heard the news. A black-haired man in a shirt asks, which ones? The gray-haired man replies that it is about that cruel minotaur whom someone defeated. The man in the shirt asks if this bully is really dead and who killed him. A black-haired man with a hood sits at the table. There is a helmet on his table, and he drinks a drink from a mug. The blonde puts a plate with a red dish on the table and tells the protagonist that this is his portion, and then adds that judging by his clothes, he is either a mercenary or a traveler. He crosses his arms and with a smile on his face asks the protagonist where he came from. The protagonist drinks from a mug and says that he is from the village of Aram. The blonde man with a serious expression asks if this is really the northern village that was recently exterminated. The protagonist's eyes are covered by the shadow of his hair. He asks the blonde if he should answer. The blonde puts his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and then apologizes to him and tells him that he doesn't have to. He adds that he had a friend there, that's why he asked, and then asks the protagonist to forget. The main character eats the dish that was brought to him. He thought that perhaps he knew which friend the blonde was talking about and it had nothing to do with him. Many houses are engulfed in flames. The protagonist thought that he was just a stranger with no connections. He remembers how he walked with a hood and a bag in his hand. The main character with a bloody eye clenched his teeth. He holds the wounded part of his face and says that his head is splitting. He looks at the blood on his hand and is surprised. He turns his head in the direction where someone is shouting, "Everyone here." 3 warriors are running somewhere. A man with a spear shouts to the guards to protect the village. The protagonist looks at a man in armor with a spear and wonders why they have costumes, like from the Middle Ages, and are they really filming a movie here? He thought that everyone looked so familiar. Someone screams because of pain. The protagonist, with one eye closed, looks in the direction where the scream is coming from. Someone is stabbing a guard with their claws. The slain guard falls to the ground near a large wolf-like monster. The monster opens its mouth. The protagonist thought that the moment he saw him, everything became clear. He sees the monster licking blood from his hand and wonders if this 2-legged wolf-like monster is a wolfrican. He looks at the corpses of the guards lying on the ground. With a surprised expression on his face, he asks if these people are from the Black Ring of Banta. A man in a dark vest and a black-haired woman ask what they will call the protagonist. He remembers 3 children, red and gray boys and a white-haired girl. One of the 3 children shouts, "Faster, hands." The white-haired girl asks the protagonist if he is going to buy herbs again. The red-haired guy whispers something to the guard and calls him boss. The white-haired girl says that it is poisonous. The blonde eats something and asks the protagonist, "Are you hands?" The protagonist holds his head and screams. He wonders if these are all the body's memories. The protagonist looks down and says that the names of those who just died are Jorba and Bodine. Ash flies in front of his face and he says that this place is the starting point of the Black Ring of Banta, the village of Aram. The monster pointed its head upward. He looks around. He turns his attention to the protagonist. The protagonist makes a frightened expression on his face. The monster runs towards the protagonist. The protagonist thought that at this rate he would die and noticed an axe lying on the ground. He picks up the axe and thought that he needed to remain as calm as possible. The protagonist clenched his teeth. The monster has almost reached the main character and opens its mouth. He swings his clawed hand at the main character. He hits the main character's chest and breaks the axe. The protagonist coughs up blood due to a strong blow. He falls to the ground. The protagonist lies trembling on the ground and wonders if he will really die like this. The monster approaches the main character. He looks at the protagonist carefully. The main character opens his eyes wide and thinks that he will not die here. The protagonist leaned on his hands and raised his torso, and then thought, "Crawl." The main character's hand is shaking and he thought, "Please move." A monster with an angry look towers over the lying main character. The red-haired man shouts the protagonist's name. He jumps on the monster and swings his spear. He makes a cutting blow to the monster, after which it jumps back. The red-haired guy stands in front of the protagonist and asks him if he is okay. The protagonist looks at the guy who has appeared with a surprised expression and asks, "Flop." The red-haired man clenched his teeth and shouted, asking the protagonist why he sat here and does he really want to die. The monster opens its mouth wide. Wolfrican opens his mouth wide. Flop screamingly asks the monster if he really doesn't see that he is talking and calls him a scoundrel. He throws his spear at the monster. The spear hits Wolfrican's chest. The red-haired guy pulls out a sword and a round shield from behind his back. With a wary expression on his face, he gets into a fighting stance and exclaims, "Die, you stupid mongrel." He stabs the monster with his sword. The city is engulfed in flames. Flop sheaths his sword and turns to the protagonist. He asks him how long he will sit here for longer. The protagonist sits with his eyes downcast. The red-haired guy asks the protagonist if he really plans to be here until he dies. The main character replies that he is not hands. Flop, with a dissatisfied expression on his face, says that the protagonist has gone crazy and thought that this is a typical problem of those who have no real experience. He tells the protagonist that he is bothering him, and then asks him to go help others with weapons or do something else. His expression turns angry. The main character turns his pupils to the side. The red-haired guy takes the protagonist by the shirt and asks him if he's really going to ignore him. He screams and tells him that he knows where the vault is, and then asks him to stop playing dumb. The main character stands among the corpses and thought that it seemed that he had inhabited the body of a guy whose name was Hans. A ghostly image of him appears near the protagonist. He thought that he didn't know why he was here and who this Hans was. The shadow of the hair covers the protagonist's eyes. He thought that it was more important for him to understand how to survive here. The main character, with a surprised expression on his face, asks if this is even possible. He thought that monsters with a fox-like character and a talent for hunting, wolfricans, lived here. Wolf-like monsters stand in the shadows. The protagonist thought that they were seizing storage facilities to hunt people. He thought that several days had already passed since the ambush, which meant that they had already destroyed the storage facility. Wolfricans kill the city's inhabitants. The protagonist says that of course, because this is the first training in the Black Ring of Bant. The protagonist opens his mouth with a surprised expression. He smiles and says that this is where the adventure of the hero of Cadiz begins. The protagonist thought that this was the only chance of salvation for a weakling like him. The protagonist is running down the street. He looked at something. He puts his palms to his knees and breathes heavily. Drops of sweat run down his cheek and he says with a smile on his face that this is a great place. Moonlight illuminates the stable. The main character goes inside the stables. He closes his mouth. He sees horse feces. He took one of them in his hand and said that in order to get rid of the human smell, you need to put your pickiness aside. Disgust can be seen on the protagonist's face. It covers its body with horse feces for camouflage purposes. He hears someone screaming for help. With an indifferent expression on his face, he thought that he should not worry about other people. The protagonist clenched his teeth and thought that he still couldn't help them. Outside the window, someone asks for help again. The main character sits under the window and lowers his head. Someone screams loudly. The screams outside the window became shrill because the man was in pain. The main character made a surprised expression on his face. He looked out the window. He exclaims with a smile on his face that here he is, and then thought that this is a game character who raided the Wolfricans and became the hero of the Silver Moon. A man in a cloak and helmet stands with a sword in his hand among the killed monsters and holds a sword in his hand. The protagonist calls this man Cadiz. The man in the helmet points his sword forward. The protagonist says that at the end of the training, the main boss will be the Wolfrican King. The monster, enveloped in golden energy, raised its head up and howled. The protagonist calls him the Silver Mane, Durkin. The monster is looking at the Cadiz. The Cadiz's gaze is directed at the boss. The man in the helmet makes a dash towards the monster. Streams of wind emanate from it. He swings his sword at the enemy. He jumped on the monster. The main character's facial expression becomes shocked. The protagonist thought that losses were inevitable, but the Cadiz had to survive. He sees the corpse of a man wearing a helmet and wonders why this happened. The protagonist, with an upset expression on his face, says that this is not the end. He asks, "Games have a respawn system, right?" The main character smiles and thought that he would return, because it's just a game. Lifeless Cadiz lies on the ground. The protagonist closes his eyes and thought, only calm. He clenched his hand into a fist and thought that if Cadiz did not return, then the only one who could save him was himself. The protagonist punches himself in the face. He says with a serious expression that if the training goes as expected, he thought that he knew this world and understood it well. The flames spread through the village. He is standing next to Cadiz's corpse. He says with a confident expression that in order to survive, he must try something. The main character reaches his hand towards the sword of a killed warrior. He touched his hand and thought that he liked playing for Cadiz. A white-haired boy hits a training dummy made of hay with a sword. It cuts 3 stuffed animals at once with one blow. He jumped on the big bear monster. A white-haired man with a scar looks at the helmet. Cadiz is enveloped in streams of golden energy. The main character covers his eye with his hand. He holds a sword in his hand, which is enveloped in streams of golden energy. It stands in front of an unfinished building. The protagonist thought that if his assumptions were correct, there was only one way to survive. The full moon rises in the sky above the protagonist. The protagonist stands on top of an unfinished building. Dirt from the protagonist's shoes falls down. He gritted his teeth and asked if he had done the right thing, and then thought that no, there was simply no choice. The main character thought that he should take advantage of the right moment and jump. Wolfrican appears from below. The main character carefully watches the enemy. He sees the monster coming closer. At the back of the monster's head there is a crystal from which violet streams of energy emanate. The protagonist firmly grasped the hilt of the sword. He jumped down on his enemy. He quickly falls down. He took the sword in 2 hands and pointed the blade at the monster. The monster looks around. The protagonist, with an angry expression on his face, shouts, "Die." The main character stuck his sword into Wolfrican. The monster screams loudly due to pain. He turns his head back and looks at the main character. The protagonist is dangling on the back of the monster due to the fact that it began to move. He holds onto the sword tightly and exclaims, "Stupid dog." The main character asks the monster if he knows what it is. The protagonist grits his teeth and shouts to the monster, "This is your spine, monster." The monster opens its eyes wide. Wolfrican falls to his knees. The protagonist pulls a sword from the monster's back. He swings his sword and thought, "More." The monster pushes the main character away with his hand, after which he hits a wooden wall and destroys it. The protagonist is lying on the ground. He looks at the enemy and asks if he didn't stick deep enough. The monster holds onto the wounded area and walks towards the protagonist. The main character thought that everything was going according to plan. The monster opens its mouth with sharp teeth. Someone says that he became interested in why there were no corpses in the warehouse. Flop in leather boots tells the monster that he has already been here. He jumped off the ground. He jumped on the monster and shouted, "Do you think this is a warehouse?" He swings his sword at the enemy. He stabs the monster's arm with his sword. Flop clenched his teeth. Wolfrican attacks the brown-haired guy and he drops his sword. The red-haired guy falls near the protagonist. He leans on his hand and bleeds, and then asks the protagonist what he is doing and why he does not run away as usual. The protagonist thought that if he ran away now, he would not be able to kill Durkin. With a serious expression on his face, he asks the brown-haired guy why he is fighting if he knows that he has no chance against him. Flop, with an angry expression on his face, shouts that he promised himself to live. He closes his eyes a little. He falls to the ground. The protagonist remembers how, as a child, a red-haired guy put his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and asks if he is serious, then tells him that he just wants to escape. Flop looks at the protagonist and tells him that he will become much stronger so that this will never happen again. He calls the main character a coward. Behind him is a grave. The protagonist, with a serious expression on his face, says that he doesn't care because he is not Hans. He clutched the sword tightly in his hand and thought that he would do everything to survive. The protagonist points his sword at the enemy and a ghostly image of Cadiz appears behind him. The protagonist runs towards Wolfriken and thought that the enemy was already in critical condition. Wolfriken swings his hand at the protagonist and thought that he saw his movements. The main character clenched his teeth. The monster hits the main character, but he dodges. The protagonist swings his sword. He makes a sweeping horizontal strike to the Wolfriken. A large monster stands opposite the monster with a lot of smoke around. Wolfriken wrinkled his muzzle and opened his mouth. The main character dropped to one knee and his sword is no longer enveloped in streams of golden energy. He is breathing heavily and smoke is floating around him. He thought that it was all over. There were cuts on Wolfriken's chest and arm. Blood is pouring from his wounds. The main character laughs with a smile on his face. He sits down on the ground near the killed monster. A chandelier with lit candles hangs near the ceiling. The main character lies down on the bed and sighs. With a tired face, he says that this is just some kind of madness. He thought that he felt strange in Aram village, but the moment he attacked the Akrovnia crypt dungeon, his theory was confirmed. He remembers opening the double doors. He remembers how he stood near the throne with a dagger in the middle of a mountain of gold and thought that in that very place he had the sensations just like during the game of the Black Ring of Bant. He adds that the funny thing is that he is now in Han's body. The protagonist imagined the image of a person in whose body he found himself and thought that, according to his emerging memories, he seemed like an ordinary villager. He thought that there was nothing remarkable about him. There was absolutely nothing except his own name. The protagonist turns on his side and says that, in fact, he has reincarnated, but now it seems to him that he is not at all empty-handed. He sits on the bed and thought that for some reason the memories of Cadiz and his skill with a sword were firmly stuck in his head and there was still something to work on. The protagonist clenched his hand into a fist. He puts his hand forward and says, status window, status, interface, status. 3 birds are sitting on the roof of the house. The protagonist lifts his torso from the bed and stretches. He thought with a sleepy face that after collecting information by questioning the villagers over these few days, he concluded that the world is no different from before, and if this is the world of the Black Banter Ring that he remembers, then there are different heroes here. The protagonist looks at himself in the mirror. He puts on a Cadiz helmet and thought that now the most important task for him is to find Pavel Kodvan. The protagonist imagines the image of a man wearing a green cocked hat and with his hair tied in a ponytail, who is armed with a crossbow. He thought that this was a playable hero who, like Cadiz, stopped in this village. The protagonist opens the door and thought that he had already found out that he was staying at the same hotel as him. He hit Pavel with the door. The green-haired man put his hand to his bruised eye. The protagonist was surprised and thought that this was Pavel Kodvan. The protagonist has ordered a variety of dishes at the tavern and offers the green-haired guy a treat as an apology for what happened. The protagonist thought that he had only one goal, to become his comrade. The green-haired guy with a joyful expression on his face says that everything is in order, because besides, the protagonist will not accept his refusal anyway. Pavel allows steak on his plate. He puts a piece of meat into his open mouth. He closes his mouth and eats. He, with a fork in his mouth, tells the protagonist that he looks like a mercenary or a traveler, and then asks him if he is interested in large-scale enslavement of Anthro. The protagonist props his head on his hand and thinks that all he is interested in is Pavel, and then asks the interlocutor why he thinks so. The green-haired guy looks at the protagonist. He puts his fork on the table. He looks at the empty tables and tells the protagonist that everyone left for this mission in the morning, and the protagonist is still here. The main character answers the interlocutor that he is still here just like him, and then adds that they do not have a worthy leader, and these people are going to certain death. Pavel, with a gloomy expression on his face, asks the protagonist if he really craves monetary rewards just like him. The protagonist replies that no, he is not interested in money, and then gets up from his seat. He approaches the tavern owner and says that he needs a faithful companion, with whom he will subdue Anthro. He thought that what he needed was not just a companion, but a shield. The blonde man with a smile on his face asks the protagonist, who is holding a bag of gold in his hand, if he needs help with the payment. He thought that if he solved his financial problems, he would easily become his comrade, because this guy is driven by money. Pavel looks at the gold coins on the table. He smiles and thought that the protagonist is richer than he thought. He leaves the protagonist and says that he is more comfortable fighting alone. But if the protagonist survives this mission, he will consider working together. Fog hovers among the mountains and treetops. The protagonist and his partner are walking among the trees. He thought that he didn't care about heroic things, about saving the world. He adds that Pavel will become a hero, and he will only be his companion, helping him on his difficult journey. The protagonist looks at his partner and thought that he only needs security and a guarantee that he will not be killed, and Pavel is the ideal person whom he can trust. The green-haired guy looks around. The protagonist thought that the green-haired guy was a hunter well versed in traps and dungeon strategies. The green-haired guy touches the cut root of a tree, and the protagonist thought that in the game he is a character of easy difficulty, which means that the probability of his survival is higher. Pavel holds the root in his hand and tells the protagonist that this is Anthro's root. He looks into the distance and says that very soon they will get to Anthro's, and then wishes the protagonist good luck. The protagonist responds to his partner that he also wishes him good luck, and then mentally told the green-haired guy that he believes in him. A huge living tree pierces several warriors. Pavel sits on the branch of a tree, and the protagonist hides at the base of one of the trees. The main character eats popcorn and wonders whether he should just watch from the sidelines. The crossbowman takes aim at one of the faces of the living tree. He looks at the enemy with a confident expression on his face. It hits the eye of one of the living tree faces. The monster destroys the branch of the tree where the crossbowman stood, and he jumped to another branch. He aims at a tree with red bolts in his crossbow and says that it will take at least 3 shots to take down this Hulk. Pavel jumps from one tree branch to another and shoots 3 times at a living tree. A living tree opens its mouth and screams loudly. It tries to grab the crossbowman with a wooden tentacle, but he jumped away. The green-haired guy flies upside down and asks the enemy if he even knows how much this thing cost. The protagonist says that it was a red-colored stone that explodes on impact. Pavel holds a red stone in his hand, and the protagonist thought that their thoughts were similar. The green-haired guy throws a stone at the enemy. He aims at a stone with his crossbow. He fired a crossbow bolt. The crossbow bolt hits the red stone and splits it into 2 halves. There is black and red energy inside the stone. The fragments rush straight into the living tree. The monster notices that a red stone is flying at him. A devastating explosion occurs. There is a lot of smoke around the tree. The tree does not have one eye. The protagonist looks at what is happening and thinks that Pavel has exceeded all his expectations. He adds that at this rate he can easily deal with Anthro. Ash flies from a hot tree. The protagonist thought that he would definitely become a hero. A crossbowman with a wary look aims at a tree. He noticed something. He looks down with a shocked expression on his face. He raises his head up and fear can be seen on his face. The living tree smiles maliciously. A wooden tentacle is directed towards the green-haired crossbowman. The tree makes many attacks on the tree where the crossbowman was. The protagonist drops a bucket of popcorn on the floor and wonders what kind of chaos this is. The protagonist remembers the murdered Cadiz and says that even though he died, Pavel seems not so weak. He looks up and asks how his weapon could break at such a crucial moment. He lowers his head and says that this is some kind of nonsense. He looks at the living tree and says that everything went wrong, and then thought that now, after Pavel's death, he should concentrate on a new business. The living tree smiles maliciously. The protagonist looks at him and thought that he has no choice but to fight Anthro. He pulls the sword back and thought it would be difficult, but with the sword skills he received from Cadiz, he has a chance. The protagonist cuts the tree roots that are heading towards him. The light of the sword is reflected from the protagonist's helmet, and I thought that in order to definitely win, 2 more things are needed. The main character saw Pavel's bag with stones from red flowers. Golden energy emanates from a hole in the protagonist's helmet. The roots of the tree rise up. They aim at the main character, but miss. The protagonist grabbed the bag of the green-haired crossbowman. He looks at his hand and the image of Pavel appears above him, and then he says that this is his ability. A living tree raises a large wooden hand. The hand is directed towards the protagonist. The main character jumped away from the enemy's attack. The monster's long arm is stuck in a tree. The protagonist climbs onto the hand of a revived tree. He almost reached the enemy's face. A living tree screams loudly at the main character. The protagonist takes his leg back and covers himself with his hands. He thought that because of this scream he could not get closer. The protagonist stands, resisting the wind. He sheaths his sword. He takes out a dagger and thinks that now he has something more than the art of wielding a sword. The main character swings a dagger and the image of Pavel appears above him, repeating the movements of the protagonist. He throws his dagger at the enemy. The dagger hits a living tree. The dagger sticks out from the living tree between the eyes. The protagonist looks at the enemy and says that he has seen this scene many times, but that doesn't make it any less creepy. One of the faces of the animated tree moves forward. The protagonist thought that the only way to defeat Anthro was to destroy the core on his face, so for travelers who see him for the first time, the battle turns into despair and acceptance of their own demise. The faces of the revived tree become its separate heads. The protagonist thought that it was the same with him, but now he knows his weakness. The protagonist looks closely at his enemy. One of the heads smiles. One of the monster's heads is heading towards the main character. The protagonist jumped onto a tree. He jumps from one part of the tree to another. The monster's head opens its mouth and almost reached the protagonist, who thought that he had all the same attacks as in the Black Bant ring. Golden energy emanates from the protagonist and he thought that he needed to hit him before he screamed. The main character hits the monster's head and destroys it into two parts. He jumped from one head to the other. He hits the monster's head and strong currents of wind move away from the point of impact. The sword pierced directly into the forehead of the head, inside of which there is a purple core. The protagonist jumped away from the monster's head. He takes the dagger out of its sheath. He throws a bag of black and red stones at the enemy and swings his dagger. The main character throws a dagger at the enemy. The monster's head wrinkled its face. The dagger hits one of the stones, which ended up in the monster's mouth. A red explosion occurs inside the monster's mouth. The protagonist shows the middle finger to the monster and says, "Bye-bye, monster." There is a powerful explosion that destroys the entire tree. The protagonist walks away from the blown-up tree and says that this is just madness. He takes off his helmet and keeps it under his hand. The protagonist imagines Cadiz and Pavel, and then thinks that he combines their sword skills and throwing ability. The protagonist clenched his hand into a fist and golden streams of energy began to envelop it. He thought that it seemed like he could absorb abilities. He walks among the trees and thought that he was beginning to think that this world had high hopes for him. The main character put his hand to his forehead and thought that he didn't want this, and then said that he would never become a hero. He thought that it was time for him to go to Malik Castle, because he should be there. A shadow falls on the protagonist's back. He thought that to get to Malik Castle, he needed to fight a boss of medium difficulty. The protagonist imagines a skeleton in armor and with a sword in his hand, Gommel, a martyr thirsting for darkness. He adds that everything would have been simpler if Pavel had not died. But now, in order to kill Gommel, he needs a tool that can help him. The village of Calyx. Sunlight illuminates the settlement. The gray cat is stretching. The main character walks along a village alley. He walks towards a man with a pauldron on one shoulder. The protagonist stands next to him and says, "Bell of Wisdom." A man with one shoulder pad smiles, and one gold one is visible among his teeth. The main character goes down the stairs. He thought that if he remembered correctly, he could find this tool here. The protagonist passes through a room with columns and goes down another staircase. Clandestine brokerage office Owl's Nest. There are people walking on the streets of the underground place. A girl examines goods in a shop. The main character is walking down the street. He sees in front of him the entrance to the room, above which hangs a sign. A girl with purple eyes and blue hair pays attention to the protagonist. She approaches the protagonist and tells him that he seems to be new, and then asks him if he needs help. The protagonist replies that it's not worth it, he's already used to it. The girl with a misunderstanding on her face wonders what the protagonist is used to and who it is. The protagonist thought that the Black Ring of Banta has an incredibly high difficulty of passage, and in order to reduce it at least a little, beginners come here. The protagonist opens the curtain and says that he remembers this too. He passes by prison cells filled with people. He stands near the camera, where a girl with white hair is sitting on the ground. The main character points his finger at the girl and tells her that he chooses her, and then calls her his unique instrument. A white-haired girl with red eyes looks at the protagonist. Evening light illuminates the fortress walls. Northern entrance to the village of Calyx. One of the two guards yawns as the protagonist and the white-haired girl walk through the double doors. The main character looks at the sky. He turns to the girl and thought that the slave he bought yesterday felt uncomfortable in his presence. The girl follows the protagonist, combining her hands. The main character thought that so be it, because the girl is only a temporary tool that can help him. The white-haired girl turns her head away from the protagonist, but looks at him with her pupils. She approaches the main character. The protagonist and the girl lean on the wall and look at a cart with a horse, which is accompanied by Wars. The main character says that they are here, the Red Crocodile Teeth Squad. The warriors are walking to the right of the cart. Among them there is a bearded man with a large sword. The protagonist says that this is their leader, Gerbier. A bearded man walks with a sword on his shoulder and a smile on his face. The protagonist takes a closer look at his sword and wonders if it is really a huge scarlet sword, and then reports that it is not just a two-handed sword, it is really just huge. The girl with a misunderstanding on her face looks at the man with the sword. The protagonist thought that by watching him, he received enough information. There are boxes inside the cart. The main character thought that even at this moment the heroes were becoming stronger and he, knowing their list, could easily find them. The protagonist follows the cart. He turns to a slave named Lemelin. The girl looks at the protagonist and answers, yes. The main character tells the girl that they need to speed up, so he asks the girl to keep up. The main character walks forward and thinks he doesn't expect much from this child. The main character walks against the background of the evening sky and thought that her task was to distract the monsters in case of any problem. Birds sit on the rocks nearby. The girl looks at the birds with a frightened expression on her face, and the protagonist thought that, in other words, she was bait. The girl follows the protagonist, who walks forward and thought that it probably wouldn't be worth mocking her like that. The main character and the white-haired girl see many skulls in front of them and the entrance to the room. The protagonist turns to Lemelin, who jerks and makes a frightened expression on her face. The protagonist tells the girl to come here. The white-haired girl looks at the protagonist. The white-haired girl sees the protagonist take out a bottle. She comes closer to the protagonist. The main character opens the bottle and pink smoke flies out at the girl. The girl rubs her eye and calls the master. She opens one eye. The girl looks at her hands and smoke comes from her. The protagonist says that it is prepared from the fruits of Cadbellum. He imagines the fruit and, telling the girl that it can temporarily mask the smell, pours the contents of the bottle onto the girl's head. The white-haired girl replies, okay, with a smile on her face. The protagonist thought that the action time was limited, but this way they could avoid meeting monsters. The protagonist turns around and thought it was better to avoid problems. The full moon is shining brightly in the sky. The protagonist and the girl walk through the ruins. The main character rests his chin and thought that it was obvious that he was not going to help Gerbier. He looks at the stairs. He goes upstairs and says that the only thing he can trust is the situation he is in, not the person. A white-haired girl follows the protagonist up the stairs. The main character stopped. He was looking somewhere and thought that after seeing the deaths of those two heroes in whom he believed so much, he should take into account any possibilities available to him. The protagonist sees a skeleton. Many skeletons surrounded the Gerbier group. There are many rocks along the path to the entrance of the ruins. Skeletons beat one of the lying warriors. There is a scroll on the ground. One of the skeletons is holding a human hand, and the other has stuck a spear into an already killed warrior. Among the skeletons stands Gommel, who is enveloped in blue energy. He stuck his weapon into a mountain of skulls. Darkness-hungry martyr Gommel. The protagonist sits on a hill and says that Gerbier won't cope either. He thought that he couldn't say for sure whether he was confused by what he saw, or whether he had the mind of a dried smelt, because he was not a game character, but probably the others were no different from him. The protagonist props his head up with his hand and says that it's time to take matters into his own hands. He stands up and says, "Go ahead, Lemelin." The protagonist asks the girl if she remembers what he told her last time. The girl puts her hands together and asks the protagonist if he is really going to do this. The protagonist looks at the girl and asks her, "Do you think I'm joking?" The girl trembles and answers that no. The protagonist opens the bag and tells the girl to run as fast as she can if she values her life. He adds that this is the only way she can stay alive, and then informs her that this is her payment for completing the task. He hands her 5 gold coins. The girl, with admiration on her face, thought that 5 gold coins were equal to 400 loaves of bread. The protagonist asks the girl if this is not enough and she needs more. Lemelin thought that this was a lot of money. The main character takes out a stick and says that when burned, it emits a scent that attracts enemies. He adds that the girl should take her and run where he said. The protagonist uses a flint to light a stick. The stick is now burning and the protagonist tells the girl not to return to him after this, and then informs her that she should leave and live for her own pleasure. The red-eyed girl looks away and wants to say something about the agreement. The protagonist asks the girl if he really didn't tell her. He holds a stick in front of him and asks the girl if he didn't tell her, and then tells her that he terminated her contract before they came here. Lemelin looks at the main character with a surprised expression. The main character tells the girl that he has no need to lie to her, because she can check it herself later. The main character and the girl look at the square. The protagonist commands the girl to run, after which she replies, "Okay." The girl jumps down. She landed on the floor not far from the skeletons. She waves a burning stick over herself. She shouts for the skeletons to come to her, after which they pay attention to her and walk towards her. Gommel also looks at the girl. He puts his hand forward. Skeletons with weapons at the ready approach the girl. Lemelin's face shows fear. The girl runs away from many skeletons. The protagonist holds a stone in his hand and thought that the white-haired girl was quick, so the skeletons would not catch up with her. He throws a stone at the enemy. The stone flies towards the head of the skeleton with red energy in its eyes. The stone hits the enemy in the head and bounces off him. The stone lights up red. An explosion occurs near the boss's head. The protagonist picks up a shield from the ground and says that there are 3 left. He looks ahead and says that he thought at least 5, but he's better. He sees 3 skeletons in chainmail in front of him. A white-haired girl runs away from skeletons. She runs barefoot across the stone floor. She runs down the alley where the skeletons are. She remembers the protagonist telling her not to think and just run straight north. The girl gritted her teeth and thought that the skeletons would not be able to run after her after crossing the northern gate. A white-haired girl runs between many skeletons. She runs towards the broken gate. She runs through the gate, and the skeletons stop as soon as they reach the gate. The red-eyed girl exclaims that she succeeded. The white-haired girl turns back and thought that they are no longer chasing and everything is happening as the gentleman said. The girl, with a surprised expression on her face, thought that the red seal meant that she was an indentured slave. There is a red symbol near the girl's collarbone. She thought that this meant that she could be used as a tool or a toy, and then abandoned. The girl grabs her shirt. Her hand trembles and she says that she fell for it, it was just bait. She falls to her knees and trembles, and then thinks that she thought she was going to die here. The girl cries and in a trembling voice says that he did not lie. A burning stick falls to the ground and the girl thought that she was now free. The skeleton swings its sword at the protagonist. He hits the main character's shield. The protagonist stabs the skeleton with his sword. He looks at the skeletons behind him and thought that this was Pavel's favorite weapon. The protagonist throws his sword at the skeleton and thought that his throwing skills were simply incredible. The sword is stuck into the skeleton's head. The skeleton is still standing and holding a spear in its hands. The skeleton goes to the protagonist, who thought that it was not strong enough, but will go. A skeleton with a spear in his hands runs towards the main character, who thought that a second would be enough to delay him. The main character holds a huge sword in his right hand. An image of a smiling gerbier appears above the protagonist and he says that the time has come for the classic, a two-handed sword. The main character swings his sword at a skeleton with a spear. He makes a wide attack on it, after which the skeleton is destroyed into 2 parts. He thought it was easy, as if he were swinging an ordinary sword. The protagonist looks away and wonders if he has also adopted Gerbier's physical abilities. He looks away and is attacked by a skeleton with a spear. The skeleton thrusts at the protagonist, who swings his sword. He hits the skeleton and breaks it into 2 parts. The protagonist stands among the streams of smoke and says that he is done with this little thing. The protagonist imagines the image of a hooded skeleton and says that now it is time to deal with Gommel. Moonlight illuminates the ruins. An enemy with a huge mace hits the protagonist, but he dodges the blow. The protagonist thought that he took care of the small skeleton summoned by Gommel, but this is only half the battle, because the problem lies in his strong body and recovery speed. The main character runs towards the enemy and thought that the power he had gained would be enough. He adds that it's hard to get close to him because he's swinging this huge thing so recklessly. The main character looks at the enemy and thought that he needed to be stopped. Gommel swings his mace at the protagonist. The protagonist defends himself with his sword and shield. The enemy hits the protagonist's sword and shield. The protagonist's sword breaks and the blow falls on the shield, causing the protagonist to be pushed away. The protagonist is pushed back after being attacked by an enemy. He trembles and leans on half his sword. The enemy swings a mace at the main character. It hits the protagonist's shield. The main character is pushed into the wall due to the force of the blow. He falls to the ground. He raises his sword. He coughs up blood. The protagonist in the bloody helmet thought that with his frail body he might die. He looks at the other half of the sword and thought that he wouldn't be able to use the Gerbier sword anymore. He takes off his helmet and asks God, "What am I doing?" The main character throws his helmet on the floor and says that he is obsessed with these abilities like crazy. He put his hand to his cheek and said that the weapon was broken and his body was not in the best shape. He bowed his head and said, "Okay, never mind." He says with a serious expression that from now on he will follow his original plan to enslave Gommel. The protagonist stands in front of a skeleton that stands by the fountain. The main character runs towards his enemy. A skeleton with blue energy in its eyes swings a mace at the main character, and black and purple energy emanates from it. The main character thought that each of his attacks was dangerous, but it would be very useful if he deprived the enemy of his balance. The protagonist runs at the enemy, who swings a mace. He stops abruptly. He raises his hand with the stone up. He throws a stone at the enemy. The stone flew right under the skeleton's feet. An explosion occurs under the enemy's feet. The main character takes something out of his bag and says that this power will be useless. He takes the bottle out of his bag. The protagonist throws the bottle at the enemy. The bottle breaks on Gamel's armor. The enemy's armor and arm were corroded by the liquid in the bottle. He drops his mace to the ground. The enemy looks at his missing hand. The protagonist holds a chain with a weight at the end in his hand and asks the enemy, "How do you like it?" "Liked." The main character twists the chain and with a serious expression on his face tells the enemy that he has saved this holy water especially for him. He pulls the chain back and tells the enemy that it is very effective against undead like him. The chain twists around the enemy's body. The main character gritted his teeth and thought that the Gamel core was in his head, so if he broke it, he would die. The main character makes several jumps and ends up behind the enemy. The protagonist sits on the enemy's shoulders and squeezes the chain on the enemy's head. He takes out another bottle. He breaks the bottle over Gamel's head. The skeleton's skull dissolves due to the holy water, causing it to open its mouth, revealing a blue stone. Smoke is coming from the hole in the skull. The bone tissue of skeletons is quickly restored. The protagonist thought that he knew that the wound would heal quickly because it was close to the heart. The main character, with a calm expression on his face, says that he has prepared for this too. He opens the bottle with his teeth and says that he has a lot of money, so he bought holy water for him alone. The protagonist sticks the bottle into the skeleton's head. He pours the contents of the vial inside the enemy's skull. The skeleton screams loudly due to pain. The protagonist says that it still helped, and the enemy grabs the protagonist's shield. The main character raises his hand with a chain and a sickle at the end, and then says that it is not as useless as it seemed. He takes something out of his bag. He opens another bottle with his teeth and vaguely tells the enemy that it's time to finish with him. The protagonist pours the contents of the bottle into the nose of the skeleton's head. The defeated Gamel lies by the fountain, and the protagonist sits nearby. The enemy's hand does not move. The protagonist looks down and thought that last time he fought just as hard. He asks why all this is happening to him, and then he thought that he just wanted to help the heroes. The protagonist imagines the image of a Cadiz. He imagines the image of Pavel. The image of Gerbier appears before him. The protagonist thought that he just wanted to live in peace and tranquility. He put his hand to his stomach and said that now he doesn't even know what to think. He noticed something to the side. He sees Lemelin in front of him, who is trembling. The protagonist passes through the ruins of the arches. He looks at the ruins ahead. The main character closes one eye and clenches his teeth, and then says that after every fight it's the same thing. The protagonist averted his pupils to the side. He looks at the white-haired girl wearing the helmet and tells her to take it off. Lemelin takes the helmet off his head. She holds the helmet in her hands with a smile on her face. The main character sighs with a dissatisfied expression on his face and wonders how it all came to this. The full moon rises in the sky. A white-haired girl looks at the ruins. The main character, with an angry expression on his face, asks the girl why she returned. Because he said that the contract was broken. He coughs up blood. The white-haired girl sees a wound on the protagonist's chest. The girl with pity on her face thought that the protagonist was wounded and needed help. She opened the protagonist's bag. The girl bandaged the protagonist's torso. The main character puts on a shirt. The main character looks at the girl and thanks her for curing him, and then tells her that she can go. The girl closes her eyes and shakes her head from side to side. The main character tilted his head with misunderstanding on his face and thought that she really needed more money. The girl with a misunderstanding on her face looks at the protagonist, who hands her a bag of gold. Lemelin closes his eyes and shakes his head from side to side. The protagonist asks the girl if she wants something else. The white-haired girl looks at the protagonist with surprise on her face. She shakes her head in disagreement. The protagonist looks at the girl carefully. He made a dissatisfied expression on his face and thought, "Finally tell me what you need." The protagonist runs with a helmet in his hand. He runs away from Lemelin. The main character is hiding from a girl behind a tree. He clenches his teeth and looks at the girl. The white-haired girl looks around. Lemelin lies on the ground and holds onto the protagonist's cloak with his hand. The girl lies with her eyes closed. Birds are flying in the sky. The protagonist approaches the sign and says, "Alban Citadel." He thought his first destination was Malik Castle, but he decided to stop at the Citadel to learn more about the situation. On one of the signboards it is written, "Alban." The protagonist looks at the girl behind him and thought that everything would become more complicated if she went with him. He made a displeased expression on his face and thought that, to be honest, Lemelin is just a burden now. He stops and tells the girl that he will ask her again why she follows him when he freed her. The girl looks down and says that she just wants to stay with the master. The main character, with an irritated expression on his face, asks the girl why, because he didn't do anything to her. The white-haired girl says that this is the reason, because the protagonist did not hit her or hurt her. The girl clutches the helmet in her hands and wants to say something. Lemelin cries, and the protagonist asks the girl what she means. A girl with reddened cheeks looks at the protagonist and says in a trembling voice that she does not want to die. The protagonist and the girl stand opposite each other against the background of the sunset. The protagonist, with a serious expression on his face, asks the girl if she really thinks that she will live longer if she stays with him, and then asks her if she sees what state he is in now. The main character is holding his stomach. The girl looks down and says that she understands, but alone she will die much faster. The protagonist, with a sad expression on his face, tells the girl that is why he gave her several gold coins. The girl looks away and says that she is grateful to the protagonist, but in the end, someone will steal anyway, some bad people. The main character, with a dissatisfied expression on his face, asks the girl if she is stupid. He thought that he knew this, but left everything as it was, since he was not responsible for her. The girl looks at the main character with an upset expression on her face. The protagonist thought that he would like to save his life himself, because he cannot guarantee its safety. The main character looks at the crying girl and thought that the safest option for her was to stay next to him. He adds that, by the way, she is not an ordinary person, but a piebald. The protagonist imagines people with white hair and red or blue eyes, and then thought that she could easily be caught and sent back to the slave traders. The protagonist imagines a white-haired girl holding on to bars and thought that the demand for piebalds is high for many reasons, and last time she was an excellent bait, but he doesn't need anything else from her. A black bird flies behind the girl. The protagonist passes by the girl. The main character, with a gloomy expression on his face, thought that he didn't care, and then said, "So be it." He looks at the girl and tells the girl to keep the helmet safe, and then tells her that he himself will kill her if she loses it. The girl looks at the protagonist with enthusiasm. She smiles and exclaims, "Okay." The protagonist and the girl approach the citadel. The protagonist thought that if his memory served him right, soon some event would take place in the Alban citadel. The full moon rises in the night sky. Alban Citadel. The gates to the citadel are open, and the lights are on inside the Gothic buildings. A man in a hood walks along the alley of the settlement. There is a sign outside the building with a picture of a mug on it. A hooded man approaches the shop table and asks when his commission will be calculated. A woman with 3 bandaged fingers puts her hand near a book and tells the hooded man that he is too impatient. The blonde asks the hooded man how many times she should repeat, and then adds that she needs the ashes of the dead. The blonde, with a serious expression on her face, tells the man that, besides, he has already heard many times that she is the only chemist who can cure that hand. The girl puts her finger to her mouth and smiles, and then tells the man that that's why he should smile, because life is beautiful, and a smile should shine on his face. Flop, with a displeased expression on his face, tells the blonde that she talks too much. He grits his teeth and reaches his hand towards the hilt of the sword, and then asks the girl if she wants him to shorten her tongue. There is a skeleton by the wooden door. The blonde put her hand to her cheek and thought that this scoundrel had an unpleasant character, although he had a sweet face. She sees someone opening the doors to the store and thought, "Oh, a new visitor." The main character and the white-haired girl enter the room, and then the protagonist tells the blonde that he needs to buy elixirs for recovery and asks if she has anything in stock. The blonde leans on her hand and with a dissatisfied expression on her face replies that there are, but they are new, and then notes that she has never met the protagonist before. The protagonist replies that he only arrived today. The girl, with a smile on her face, asks the protagonist if this is true, and then asks him where he is from and how he knew that she sells elixirs. The girl asks the protagonist why they did it to him and whether he was really wounded and something hurts. The white-haired girl looks at the main character. The blonde asks the protagonist what he thinks about her. The main character made a gloomy expression on his face. He asks the blonde with an angry expression if it is really that important. The girl puts her hand on the chair and answers, "No, no." The blonde goes to the cabinets and shelves. Lemelin looks at the shelves with goods. The blonde opens a small drawer. She takes out 1 potion and asks the protagonist how much he needs. The protagonist replies that he needs 10 bottles. The blonde looks at the potion she got and then asks the protagonist if he knows that her potions are quite expensive. The protagonist replies that the price does not matter, and then adds that he knows their value, so he will pay back properly. The box contains 9 red bottles and 4 more bottles with a duller liquid. The blonde, with a smile on her face, asks the protagonist if he has 10 gold coins, and the protagonist replies, "Okay, let's have 15 bottles." The girl, with a surprised expression, asks the protagonist, "What?" The main character, with a smile on his face, says that he said to give him 15 elixirs, because only those prepared by her are effective. The protagonist thought that even if it ends in loss, nothing can be done. A drop of sweat runs down the protagonist's cheek and he thought that he needed to prove that he recognized her as a person. The protagonist puts the coins on the table and thought that it was she who could tell him valuable information when they became close, and, moreover, it would be great if he aroused her interest as an alchemist. The blonde hands the main character a box of potions. The protagonist tells Lemelin to give that thing from Gommel. The white-haired girl replies, "Just a second." The red-eyed girl places a bag of powder on the table, after which the blonde rests her chin. The bag contains white powder from which black energy emanates. The blonde with a smile on her face asks if these are the ashes of the dead. The protagonist, looking at the alchemist girl, thought that the fact that she was touching her chin was a sign of their rapprochement. The protagonist opens the potion and thinks that everything is happening faster than he thought. The blonde shows 3 fingers and says that she understood what the protagonist wants, and then adds that with this she can do 3 more things. The blushing girl says that she can do even more, but then the price will be higher, and then asks if he agrees to such conditions. The protagonist drinks the red potion and closes his eyes, and then says, "I don't care." He opens his eyes wide and is enveloped in green energy. The protagonist looks at the bottle with a dissatisfied expression on his face and asks what this disgusting taste is, and then thought that he doesn't want to drink it anymore. He clenches his hand into a fist and says that, however, the elixir is really effective. The blonde asks the protagonist if he really hangs around with this white-haired girl because she is his slave. The protagonist points to Lemelin and asks the saleswoman if she wants to pick it up too. The white-haired girl lowered her gaze. The saleswoman tells the protagonist that she is forced to refuse because it seems that she likes him. The protagonist props up his chin and tells the saleswoman that she is mistaken because they have known the white-haired girl for less than a week. The blonde turns her head to the protagonist and asks him if this is true, and then says that in fact it is not so important how long ago they met each other, because life is fleeting, but fate is eternal. The protagonist and a white-haired girl walk along the fortress wall. They climb up a twisting staircase. The protagonist and the white-haired girl look at the sunset in the distance. The protagonist remembered something about the castle. Lemelin looks at the sunset with admiration on her face and thought, "What a beauty." The protagonist with a serious expression says that an army of monsters will arrive here in a week. The white-haired girl turns to the protagonist and asks, "What?" The protagonist thought that in the original game this place was defended by Gerbier. The protagonist imagines a bearded warrior standing against a background of flames. The protagonist thought that now that he is dead, no one will be able to help the residents because they are vulnerable. He adds that that's why he came here. The protagonist looked wary and thought that he wanted to see how the citadel would defend itself without the help of heroes. The white-haired girl looks at the protagonist, whose gaze is directed into the distance. Many people are walking along the streets of the settlement. There is a sign with a picture of a mug and grapes on it. Many people dine at the tavern. The bald man raises his mug and shouts, "You'll see, I'll be the #1 hunter in history." The man with the scar on his eye laughs and asks the bald man if he knows about something, and then exclaims that he recently captured a henchwoman witch. Brown Eyes calls the man with the scar Cornell, and then asks him if she even exists. A man with a scar and a dissatisfied expression on his face screams and asks how many times he has to repeat that she is real. The brown-eyed man tells the man with the scar that in his opinion he is just a liar. The man with the scar asks the brown-eyed man if he really wants to fight and die. The protagonist looks at how the man with the scar grabbed the brown-eyed man by the collar and then says, "What a fool." Someone knocks a mug on the table. He tells the men behind him that they scoundrels are too noisy. The establishment worker next to him is shaking. The scarred man with an angry expression asks the hooded man what he just said, and then calls him a one-armed fool. The bald man next to him also made an angry expression. The man with the scar approaches Flop and puts his hand on his shoulder, and the guy in the hood tells the man that he said they were too noisy. He punches the scarred man in the face and shouts, "Stupid fool." He takes the hilt of the sword and asks the man with the scar if he wants a fight. The white-haired girl places kebabs on skewers on the table, and then asks the protagonist if he is sure that they can stay here. The white-haired girl put her hand to her chest, and then said that several days have passed. The protagonist eats a kebab and tells the girl not to ask unnecessary questions. He points to the plate and tells the white-haired girl to sit down and eat. Lemelin looks at the food with appetite and asks the protagonist if she can really take the food, because she is a slave. The main character turns his pupils to the side and tells the girl to just sit down and eat. The white-haired girl brings her hands together and thanks the main character with a joyful expression on her face. The protagonist thought that he did not tell Lemelin, but the upcoming event, the Spirit of the Fallen Empire, will be much worse than expected, because elite spirit knights are the same in strength as heroes. A white-haired girl eats a kebab with a happy expression on her face. Dark energy circulates over many knights in black armor. The protagonist thought that their new commander-in-chief was Reincarnated Schulteen. A cloaked knight sits on a horse with a red glow emanating from their eyes. The protagonist thought that if the citadel collapsed because of them, the game would be over. The protagonist imagines a gate opening, behind which there is a red glow. The protagonist holds a kebab stick in his mouth and thought that he must protect this place in order to prevent the end. He adds that the heroes must have wandered here during their journey. The protagonist imagines images of Cadiz, Pavel and Gerbir and then thinks that they are all dead. He adds that he hoped he would find someone else here. The protagonist looks at the fight between the visitors and asks what kind of circus this is. Flop pushes Flop away, who falls to the ground. The brown-eyed man takes his sword out of its sheath. The protagonist thought that he should defend this place with them. The protagonist sees the white-haired girl trembling and asks her, "Are you afraid?" He drinks a drink from a mug and thought that there is no choice and he will continue to look for other heroes. Flop punches the brown-eyed man in the face. The protagonist, with cheeks reddened from alcohol, thought that he would instead look for tools, because that's what they came to the citadel for. A mug flew into the protagonist's head. One of the tavern patrons raised his fist in the air and shouted, "Kill him." Lemelin, with concern on his face, asks the protagonist if he is okay. Golden streams of energy emanate from the main character, and his eyes glow brightly. He says, "How boring," and then asks the white-haired girl to give him the helmet. He thought that Lemelin probably thought that he came to the tavern just to drink, but in fact he was training. The main character puts a helmet on his head. He touches the shoulder of a tavern visitor, and thought that he was honing his sword skills for the upcoming battle. But he could not use all the powers he had received at once, nor could he continue to act, relying only on the help of the forces of dead heroes. A tavern visitor looks at the protagonist. The visitor has a frightened expression on his face. The main character punches a tavern visitor in the face. The tavern patron falls to the floor. The protagonist thought that he was not sure what to do to become stronger. Saliva flows from the mouth of a tavern visitor. Flop looks at the protagonist, who says that he fell after one hit, and then adds that he didn't even warm up. The red-eyed man asks the main character who he is. The protagonist looks at this man and thought that he was from the village of Aram. The protagonist opens his eyes wide. The protagonist remembers asking Flop if he thinks the strong survive or those who survive are strong. The red-haired guy replies that of course the fittest survive. The protagonist remembers how little he looked at Flop and the blonde girl who was lying on the ground with a thorn in her stomach. The protagonist asks if they are strong. He heard something behind him. He turns back with his eyes wide open. Flop replies, "No." The huge monster with sharp teeth and spikes protruding from its body runs towards the protagonist and the brown-haired guy. The protagonist remembers saying that they were just lucky that day. A powerful stream of energy from above is directed at the monster, after which it falls to the ground. The protagonist puts his hand to his face and, turning to the past of the owner of the body, says that he does not care about his memories. Flop holds his bladed weapon on his shoulder and asks the protagonist what he said. The protagonist thought that the body remembered him. He tells the white-haired girl to follow him, after which she replies, "Okay." The red-haired guy watches as the protagonist and the white-haired girl leave the tavern. Lemelin looks at Flop. A red-haired guy sees in a white-haired girl his childhood friend with a mole under her eye. He reaches out to her and with wide eyes asks, "Elaine." He says no, it can't be, because she's dead. A shadow covers his eyes. There is a sign hanging near the stone building with both a shield and a hammer. There are boxes, a sword and armor on the table. The protagonist asks Lemelin if she knows how to control a sword. The white-haired girl replies that she knows a little. The main character takes out a sword and asks the girl if she is doing well. The white-haired girl answers no. The main character props up his chin and asks Lemelin what about the bow. The white-haired girl replies that she has never tried it. The protagonist, looking at the girl, says that it means she can't do anything. The girl looks down and apologizes to the protagonist. The main character replies that everything is fine. The protagonist takes out a knife and props his chin, and then says that this is better than lying about his skills. The protagonist looks back and sees bladed weapons, armor and a shield behind him on the wall. He takes the crossbow from the wall. He throws the crossbow to the white-haired girl and tells her to try it. He adds that let him stay with him for now. Lemelin holds a crossbow and tells the protagonist that she has never used it. The main character made a wide smile. He looks at the girl and tells her not to worry, because she will learn from her own experience. Leaves are flying in the sky. The protagonist thought that in this world some races are despised and not recognized. Piebald. The girl stands in front of a tree and takes out a crossbow bolt from behind her back. The protagonist thought that Peabalds could be recognized by their silver hair. Their characteristics are not very well known to people. Lemelin aims at a tree with a crossbow. The main character thought that they had a fighting instinct and learned 10, no, 100 times faster than others. A crossbow flies near the foliage. The crossbow bolt hits the middle of the target. The white-haired girl clenches her hand into a fist and makes a joyful expression on her face. The protagonist says that a crossbow is easier to master than a bow and arrow, but she will still have to train for weeks. One crossbow bolt is in the middle of the target, and the other two are near it. The protagonist holds a bottle in his hands and asks Lemelin how she learned to shoot perfectly at a target in just a couple of hours, and then adds that she's definitely a piebald. He thought that there was one drawback, however. The main character opened the bottle and poured its contents into a water container, and then thought that her skill was not as good as Pavel's. The green-haired crossbowman fires his weapon. The protagonist thought that Pavel's ability allowed him to hit a target at any distance. Lemelin was no match for him. The protagonist remembers how a well-aimed shot from a green-haired crossbowman hit the enemy. Above Lemelin appears the image of a green-haired crossbowman with a smile on his face, giving him a thumbs up. The protagonist turns to the white-haired girl and calls her to him. The girl approaches the main character. The protagonist takes the bag in his hand. Lemelin takes the bag and asks the main character what it is. The protagonist says that he bought it for her, so she should try it on. A white-haired girl looks at the bag with a joyful expression on her face. The protagonist thought that Lemelin should not look like a slave during battle. He looks at the girl with a smile on his face and thought that this was an important part of their operation. Day 0. The main character removes the fabric from the clothes dryer and thought that they had prepared everything for the last week. The protagonist sees dark clouds gathering around the sun and says that they are here, and then tells Lemelin that they must go. The white-haired girl answers the protagonist, yes. She picks up her backpack from the ground. The protagonist thought that he knew this world better than anyone. Lemelin in long boots walks with a backpack on his back. The protagonist thought that in the world of Bant there is no such thing as luck. The protagonist puts his hand on his head and thought that they can only become stronger through experience and hard work. Lemelin walks with a confident look, holding onto the straps of his backpack. She walks next to the main character and asks him if he is worried. The protagonist replies, no, not at all. He thought he had experienced this 1,000 times. Many bolts are stuck into the middle of the target. Warriors in armor stand on the fortress walls. One of the warriors rings the bell and shouts, archers, in position. Several warriors climb the stairs. Many archers stand on the fortress walls. The bald man clenches his hand into a fist and with a smile on his face shouts that the time has come. More warriors come here. A man with a scar and a spear on his shoulder says that he is already bored. Flop is standing next to him. The red-haired guy looks at the protagonist and the girl and says that this is the guy and girl with silver hair that the alchemist told him about. The red-haired guy clenched his hand into a fist and says that he will thank the protagonist later. Streams of black energy are visible above the army of knights, through whose helmets blue light leaks. Some knights wear banners with the symbol of a sword with wings. Many knights with spears go to the walls. One of the knights shouts, "Do you hear, invaders?" Dark energy hits the fortress wall, leaving a dent in it. Streams of dark energy are directed towards the protagonist, who calls the knights savages, and the knight asks the protagonist how he dares to say such a thing. One of the knights shouts, "Just dare to capture our beautiful citadel." Lemelin and the warriors behind the protagonist are shaking in fear. The Dark Knight shouts, "The vast sky is watching you." The protagonist holds a bolt in his hand and asks his enemies if they are afraid of divine punishment. One of the knights asks what this means. The main character replies that he is no longer going to listen to it. The image of Pavel appears above the main character. The protagonist, who holds a bow in his hands, is enveloped in golden energy. He thought that as long as he saw him, he could shoot at him. The protagonist looks at the knights with spears. He pulls the bowstring and thought that the shot would be the best, and this is not an exaggeration at all, but Pavel's skill. The main character releases the bowstring. The arrow flies quickly towards the enemy. It hits one of the enemy knights in the head. The knight crumbles after the protagonist shoots. A man with a scar, a bald man and a brown-eyed man look at the protagonist with bewilderment on their faces. The warrior in plate armor and the warriors behind him also look at the protagonist. Lemelin turns to the protagonist with a shocked expression. The main character with a bow stands on the battlements of the fortress wall. The protagonist looks at the white-haired girl and asks, "What?" He thought that skipping cutscenes was normal. There are black clouds in the purple sky. One of the knights looks at the protagonist. The knight whose helmet emits a purple glow shouts to the protagonist that he has no respect. Warriors in chainmail raise their hands up and shout loudly. One of them shouts, "One hit, one skill." The bald man pulls a sword from behind his back and with a smile on his face shouts that they are weaker than they seem, so they will send them back to their graves. The protagonist thought that without holy water nothing would work, but they don't need to know that. He tells Lemelin to keep up, and the girl follows him and exclaims, "Okay." The main character tells the girl that they are almost there, after which the girl slightly tilts her head with bewilderment on her face. He thought it was a signal flare signaling the start of war. Swirling flames fly into the sky. Lemelin watches what is happening with a shocked expression on his face. The protagonist and the white-haired girl enter the room. The warriors are watching something with surprise on their faces. A huge fireball is directed towards the fortress wall. A powerful explosion occurs, destroying part of the wall, and smoke floats around them. Enemies in helmets and robes raise their hands up, after which fiery circles appear above them. A man with a red glow from his helmet points his halberd forward. The knights in front of him are running towards the fortress walls. Flop covers his face from the rubble of the destroyed fortress wall. Many of the city's defenders stand in front of a hole in the wall. One of the defenders shouts that the wall is broken. A large gap appeared in the fortress wall. A warrior in plate armor put his hand forward and shouted, "Everyone, get ready for battle." He informs the defenders that the next one is on the way, so they need to aim at the magicians on the back line. After which the crossbowmen next to him take their positions. An archer in chainmail pulls the bowstring. The man with the scar says that it's time to get to work, and then they say that they will become rich, since for each enemy they give 20 silver coins. The man with short hair made a desperate expression on his face and shouts that they will all die, and then adds that he wants to leave and asks to let him go. He runs, looking back, and shouts that he is not going to die here. The man with the scar and the bald man look at him with disapproving glances and ask if he still calls himself a mercenary, and then adds, "What a disgrace." Flop replies that running away to survive is a smart decision. The red-haired man with a serious expression on his face says that although he does not know whether he will be saved. A bald man with a sword on his shoulder asks a man with a scar if he thinks they will get out of here alive, and he replies that he is not sure. But you never know, maybe a hero will appear to save them. Several more fireballs fly into the fortress walls of the citadel. One of the enemy knights cut off the head of a brown-eyed man who was screaming for help. His lifeless head falls to the ground, leaving a trail of blood behind. A knight with a cross-shaped hole in his helmet and a purple glow from there strikes one of the defenders of the citadel. An enemy with a purple glow from his helmet impales the city's defender, and the remaining enemies who came through the hole in the fortress wall are fighting other city defenders. A man with a scar meets an enemy knight with a spear in his hand. He pierces the enemy with his melee weapon. The knight crumbles after being hit by a man with a scar. He says with concern on his face, "I'm going to die here." He looks at his spear and says that he has always been confident in his abilities, but they are different from other monsters. He looks around and says that he wonders how the others are doing. He sees a bald man make a cutting blow to an enemy knight. The bald man shouts that they will not die here. He clenched his sword tightly and shouted that otherwise the enemies would come for the souls of his family and friends. He swings his sword at the enemy and shouts, "Fight for your families." He hits at the same time as the enemy. He says with a smug smile that they can handle it. An enemy with a hood and a knife in his hand appears behind the bald man and tells him that he talks too much. A shocked expression can be seen on the man's head. The hooded enemy cut off the bald man's head. Blue energy emanates from him and he says that the invaders must die, every single one. A light glows brightly inside his helmet. With a shocked expression on his face, the hooded enemy jumps and quickly moves towards the scarred man, leaving a shadow trail behind him. The man with the scar clenches his teeth and holds out his spear in front of him. He strikes and is hit by dark energy, but the enemy is behind him, swinging his sword, and then tells the man with the scar, "Die." The man with the scar wrinkled his face in fear. Someone on a horse rushes towards the man with the scar and towards the enemy. The horse makes a jump, and on it is the protagonist with a halberd in his hand along with Lemelin. The man with the scar looks up with surprise on his face obscured by a shadow. The hooded enemy also looks up. A shadow falls on his face. The horse hits the enemy on the head with its hoof and thus breaks his helmet. The hooded enemy falls to the ground. The horse looks at the man with a scar near his eye. She sinks to the floor, and black and purple streams of energy emanate from her hooves. The main character with Lemelin behind him asks the man with the scar if he is okay. The man with the scar answers, yes. The main character looks at the man with the scar and replies, wonderful. The horse goes further and the main character tells the man with the spear to return to the others and tell them to retreat. The protagonist tells Lemelin that they will go ahead, and the white-haired girl replies, aha, with a smile on her face. The man with the scar puts his hand forward and with a shocked expression on his face tries to say something, but does not have time. He looks at the protagonist and the girl on the horse moving away. The horse runs so fast that currents of wind emanate from it. One of the two knights standing nearby notice the protagonist. The main character tells the white-haired girl that they will break through, and the girl with a surprised expression on her face replies, yes. The protagonist thought that they must kill hundreds of spirits to end this siege. The main character, a hero with a halberd in his hand, rushes towards the enemy knights. The white-haired girl hits one of the enemies in the head, after which he begins to crumble. Light comes from the protagonist's helmet and he says that he doesn't have time for them. He imagines an enemy with a cross cut out on his helmet and thought it was time to fight the final boss. The protagonist makes numerous strikes with a halberd shrouded in golden energy at enemy knights, cutting them into pieces. The main character runs with lightning speed through the knights who are near the hole in the wall. The man with the scar looks at the protagonist and says that this guy is not afraid of death, just like a hero. Air currents come from a fast-running horse. Enemy knights attack the protagonist and his partner. The protagonist thought that judging by their movements, each of the spirits was elite. He imagines a spirit with a helmet with a cutout in the shape of a cross. The main character thought that, however, they had little intelligence. Golden streams of energy emanate from the protagonist, and he thought that if he combined the art of horsemanship with the art of wielding the Cadiz spear, he would get the art of spearing and horsemanship. Golden streams of energy also emanate from the horse. The protagonist, halberd and horse have a golden aura. The main character cut one of the knights. With another blow, he defeated several opponents at once, while Lemelin fires one more shot from the crossbow. The main character makes blow after blow and heads towards the crowd of knights. The knight with a red glow from his helmet thought that someone dared to break into them, and then noticed that it was funny. He raises the halberd above him and crackling black and purple energy appears around it, and then he says, come to me. He knocks the bottom of the halberd on the floor and after that long streams of black and purple energy emanate from there. Streams of energy pass between the dark knights. Streams of energy are directed to the protagonist's hand. The protagonist's horse stands on its hind legs. The red-eyed girl thought that the way was open. The red knight points his halberd at the main character. The protagonist looks at his partner and tells her to get off, after which the girl asks, what? The main character tells the girl that everything is fine. They will not attack her. A knight with 3 slits in his helmet stands quietly. Lemelin dismounts from his horse, while the knights just stand next to them. The red knight asks the main character if he really came all this way here alone. The protagonist replies to the enemy that not quite while Lemelin looks at the protagonist. The red knight asks the main character why he is here, after which he puts his hand forward and streams of red and black energy emanate from him. The knights look at the protagonist. They point their spears towards the main character and Lemelin. A girl with a frightened expression on her face turns to the main character. The main character takes something out of the girl's backpack and tells her to be quiet. The protagonist throws a handkerchief with a symbol on the floor. The handkerchief falls near the red knight. A knight with a red glow in his helmet exchanges glances with another knight. The knight with a blue glow inside his helmet lowers his head. He reaches his hand towards a sheet of paper. The red knight looks at the symbol and says that this is the family knight's coat of arms, and then asks the main character, are you one of them? The protagonist replies that this is true. He imagines a scarf with a symbol of a helmet and 2 swords, and then thought that throwing the family coat of arms at an opponent was a traditional way for knights to challenge each other to a duel. 2 horsemen with spears stand opposite each other. The protagonist thought that this guy was a knight who put honor above all else, a knight captain of a fallen empire, Reborn. The protagonist imagines the image of a knight against the backdrop of a sunset, and a symbol with a sword and wings. The red knight, looking at the scarf, says what it means. In this era, some old customs are still preserved. He adds that honor is not just a word. The main character thought that honestly, this coat of arms is a fake, which he came up with in a hurry. But the knight cannot check whether it is a lie. The main character moves his hand to the side and tells the enemy that although he became a spirit, he heard that he was a knight with an honor incomparable to others. The protagonist calls the red knight Reborn and challenges him to a duel. The plume on the red knight's helmet flutters in the wind. The protagonist on a horse stands opposite the enemy. Lemelin's face shows concern. The protagonist watches the enemy and wonders why he is silent and whether he really will not accept the challenge. The protagonist grabs the reins tightly and wonders if it's time for him to run. The Red Knight's plume rises straight up due to his destructive aura. He shouts that a knight who knows what honor is in such a nasty time is funny. The enemy points the halberd towards the protagonist and asks him if the piebald is his servant. The white-haired girl is surprised by the knight's words. The main character looks at the girl and answers the knight, sort of. The knight tells the protagonist that then the world will know about his knightly valor, even if he is destined to fall here. He adds that since she is their servant, he will appoint her as a witness to the duel between them. Lemelin asks, "What?" with a worried expression on his face. The protagonist tells the Red Knight that everything will be as he wishes, and then thought that his words were a guarantee that Lemelin would not be injured during their duel. He thought that everything had gone according to plan so far, but the hardest part hadn't even begun yet. The Red Knight shouts to the protagonist that a knight will never shy away from battle, and then adds that he accepts his challenge. Reincarnated raises the halberd above himself and shouts, "Al bros." Dark red energy emanates from his horse's eyes. The Red Knight on horseback runs towards the main character. The knight, around whom red dark energy circulates, shouts that he is the captain of the Order of the Knights of the Son of the Bahan Empire, Reincarnated Schultine. He then asks the protagonist what his name is. The protagonist introduces himself as Evan. The Red Knight points his halberd towards the protagonist and shouts that let their noble duel go down in history. The main character asks Lemelin, who is standing behind him, to stay behind him, and she asks him, "What?" The protagonist tells the girl that he told her not to challenge his words, and the girl replies, "Okay." Lemelin presses his hand to his chest and asks the protagonist to be careful. Reincarnated moves his hand to the side and shouts, "Let the duel begin." The protagonist thought that all the bosses he had encountered before had the same attack pattern as in the game. It is imagined as a wolfraken, enveloped in golden energy, swinging its clawed hand. He imagines golden energy emanating from the eyes of Deluc, who opens his mouth wide. He remembers how the revived tree pointed its heads at the protagonist. Gommel opens his mouth wide and swings his mace. The protagonist thought that Reincarnated was no exception. He looks at the Red Knight. He thought there was no point in hesitating. Streams of wind come from the protagonist. He thought that he would just meet him face to face. The protagonist runs towards the enemy and smoke appears in the air. Reincarnated tells the protagonist that he seems to forget who his opponent is as he goes head-on in the attack. The Red Knight tells the protagonist that he will answer his challenge with greater force. The Red Knight moves his weapon to the side. The Red Knight put his halberd to his shoulder. The protagonist, watching the enemy, thought that his combat stance had changed to berserk mode. The full moon rises in the sky. Lemelin stands between two enemy knights. She thought with worry on her face that the atmosphere had become so oppressive and wondered if something had gone wrong. The protagonist was surprised and mentally asks what this is nonsense, and then adds that he did not expect this and wonders why the berserker mode. Berserker mode instantly increases Reinhardt's combat power the moment he is in critical condition. Dark energy circulates around the Red Knight. The protagonist thought that it could be deactivated by killing the horse. The main character, looking at the enemy, thought that nothing had changed. He just needed to kill his horse. The protagonist, standing opposite the enemy at an impressive distance, wonders whether he can fight him. The Red Knight, holding the reins, wonders if the protagonist is not going to attack, and then adds that then he will attack first. He lifts the reins up. The horse looks forward warily. Reinhard instantly disappears, leaving behind a black and red trail of energy. The knight quickly closed the distance and found himself near the protagonist, who was swinging his halberd. The Red Knight swings his weapon at the protagonist. The main character blocks the enemy's blow with his melee weapon. He moves his hand to the side and thought that Cadiz had a special ability. He could channel the enemy's power to knock him out, but to activate it, he must reflect the attack at least once. The Red Knight swings his halberd and tells the protagonist to die with honor. He hits the main character. The protagonist puts his halberd forward in order to block the oncoming blow. The enemy hit the protagonist's halberd with his melee weapon. Sparks come from the protagonist's halberd and he thought that he needed to redirect this energy. The protagonist moves the halberd to the side and a powerful stream of black and red energy from the enemy bounces back. Reinhard moves his weapon to the side. The protagonist runs on a horse and asks if the enemy has lost his balance. The Red Knight quickly runs up to the protagonist and is now opposite him. The main character looks at the horse and wonders how this scoundrel could survive. He got worried and thought that he knew that this rider was amazing, but there was one thing. And then he said, "Stupid game." The Red Knight laughs, puts the halberd to his shoulder, and then asks the protagonist what he will do and if he will go cry. The protagonist is angry and wonders if he is trying to get him emotional on purpose. He mentally turns to the enemy, "Just wait, I'll make you regret it." The main character and the knight exchange blows and powerful wind currents disperse around them. The protagonist and his enemy simultaneously strike and parry each other. Reincarnated moves his hand with the bladed weapon back and laughs, and then tells the protagonist that he is doing a good job. The protagonist puts his halberd forward and says, "Curse." He bows his head and says that he won't achieve anything with defense alone, so he needs to take every chance to attack. But because of that horse, he can't get close to him. Reincarnated goes to the protagonist and asks him, "Do you have time to think?" The enemy touched the protagonist's torso with his halberd. The protagonist's horse runs away, creating a lot of smoke under its hooves. There was a wound on the right side of the main character. He runs away from his enemy. The main character is surprised by what he saw ahead. He sees Reincarnated in front of him, with streams of black and red energy circulating around his halberd. The protagonist looks at the enemy and thought that he was clearly worried. An angry knight screams at the protagonist to die. The protagonist thought that he was unlikely to die here, after which he raised the reins up. He gets to his feet, and the main character's horse rams the enemy horse. The enemy makes a piercing gift and shouts that it is useless. The protagonist jumped away from his horse just as the knight attacked him. He thought he had one of the Cadiz skills activated in the game, and then says that he gets bonuses when facing aggressive opponents. Black and red energy is directed towards the protagonist. The main character approaches the enemy, dodging his attack. He swings his halberd at the enemy. He makes an attack and shouts, "I will finish you." The enemy is surprised by the lightning attack of the protagonist. The main character's attack rushes towards the knight's head. Golden energy emanates from the protagonist's attack and he thought, "I'm not aiming at you." The main character pierces the enemy rider's horse. He lands on the ground and smoke comes out of him. A dismounted red knight looks opposite the protagonist. The main character looks at the enemy and thought that he was able to limit his movement, but this took too much effort due to the berserker mode. The protagonist thought that Cadiz's skills were definitely strong and imagined him jumping against the backdrop of the full moon and swinging his sword. He adds that, however, this requires more endurance and he imagines himself tired and giving up. He thought that to some extent he had become stronger thanks to Gerbier, and now he could reduce his stamina consumption. He imagines a bearded man sticking his little finger up his nose. The protagonist is holding his hand and thinks his muscles are already hurting. Streams of red energy emanate from the knight. He says that this has not happened for a long time. He stands next to his dead horse and tells the protagonist that for so many years he has not met someone who could force him to dismount from his horse. He adds that the protagonist made the right decision by targeting the horse. He raises his hand at the level of the collarbone and bends his fingers, and then says that, however, the protagonist is not capable of more. He calls the name of his horse, Alberos, and then points his hand at him and red and black energy emanates from it, which is directed towards the horse. The knight points his sword at the main character. He is enveloped in red energy and tells the protagonist that from now on he will use every opportunity available to him to kill him. The main character stands at some distance from the knight. Lemelin watches their fight and says, She goes towards the main character and says that she must stop the fight. She notices someone near her. The girl stops after that. Flop asks the girl what's going on. The red-eyed girl put her hand to her chest and told the guy that the master told her that he could finish the battle. The red-haired man tells the girl that in his opinion, the main character has overestimated himself too much, and then asks if they can help him. The girl is silent for a short time. She turns her pupils aside and tells Flop that the main character said not to challenge his decisions and just wait. The red-haired guy asks the girl with bewilderment on his face if he is really a tyrant. He adds that of course it's none of his business, but if the girl thinks she needs to act, then let her act. Flop with a serious expression on his face tells the girl that otherwise she will lose her master. The moon is visible among the clouds in the sky. Enveloped in a large amount of dark red energy, the knight says, "Let's begin the second round." The protagonist got worried and says that the knight didn't even give him time to return the weapon and thought that what was happening now was not a game, but reality, but there was inventory in the black band ring. The protagonist imagines a human figure putting things into a pocket space. He adds that here you have to drag everything you need with your hands and feet. He imagines a human figure carrying a backpack on his back. The protagonist screams and asks Lemelin to throw him a sword. The girl stuck her hands into the backpack and shouted, "Yes." The angry red knight says, "Bad." He makes a dash towards the main character. Behind him he leaves a trail of black and red energy. The protagonist looks at the enemy and thought that it was already too late. Flop tells the protagonist that if he doesn't stay focused, he will completely screw up in moments like this. The white-haired girl looks at the red-haired man in surprise. The red-haired man throws a sword at the protagonist and then shouts, "Hey, Iron Head." He tells the protagonist that he will repay his hand, and the sword almost flew to the protagonist. The enemy knight swings at the main character, who reaches for his sword. The protagonist grabbed the sword by the hilt. He draws his sword from its sheath and immediately strikes at his enemy. Powerful streams of energy emanate from the protagonist and the knight. The knight says that this is not enough and he needs more. The two fighters' swords clashed. The protagonist thought that there was a huge difference between them. The knight and the main character draw their swords back. The full moon is visible behind the smoke in the sky. Flop notices that Lemelin is taking something out of his backpack. The red-eyed girl was looking for something and thought that she wanted to be useful to her master. Reincarnated makes several attacks on the protagonist, who blocks them with his sword. The knight draws his sword back and tells the protagonist that he does not see the same confidence in him. The protagonist closed his sword and blocked another attack, and then thought that his enemy would get his. He adds that he will wait until he lets down his guard and gets used to the movements. The protagonist takes a fighting stance and thinks that he must endure. The main character says with self-confidence that he trained for this moment. The Red Knight tells the protagonist that it looks like he is not ready to give up yet. He adds that he recognizes the protagonist's fortitude and calls him a knight. He moves his sword hand back. The protagonist thought that the enemy had finally changed position. He said with confidence in his voice that the time had come, after which he was enveloped in golden energy. The protagonist swings his sword. He threw his sword, and Reincarnated fought it off with his sword. The main character's sword sticks into the ground. Lemelin looks at what is happening with bewilderment. Flop exclaims, "My sword," with a shocked expression on his face. The moon rises in the night sky. The protagonist's sword stuck into the ground behind the Red Knight. Reincarnated informs the protagonist that he underestimated him, even though he analyzed his attacks. He grips the sword tightly and begins to be enveloped in red energy, and then says that it is time to end this. The Red Knight moves his sword to the side. He moves one leg back. He makes a dash towards the main character. The main character thought that he did not plan to play by the rules. He takes something out of his bag. He took out a red stone. He throws a red stone at the enemy. The knight cuts the red stone with his halberd and exclaims, "Useless." A red glow appears in front of the knight and he asks if it is a crimson stone. The protagonist asks Lemelin if she is ready, after which the girl throws the trident to the protagonist. The white-haired girl gritted her teeth and thought that this time she would not slow down. A devastating explosion occurs near the enemy. Smoke from the flames rushes into the sky. In the smoke you can see a knight who asks the protagonist if he really thinks that he can defeat him. Streams of wind come from the knight and dispel the smoke. The protagonist holds a trident in his hand and says that of course not, so he prepared. The Red Knight says that the trident in the protagonist's hand is a useless thing, and then asks him where his respect is. The main character holds a net in one hand and a trident in the other and says that all this time he was serious. Reincarnated raises his sword. The protagonist stands opposite him at some distance. The Red Knight tells the protagonist that he is not worthy to be called a knight, and then asks him if he really thinks that this thing can defeat him. The main character thought that the knight was underestimating him, as expected, because he uses the net as a weapon. He looks carefully at the enemy and adds that so be it, because he is better, now is the very moment. The main character asks the enemy whether a knight should only fight with a sword. A dissatisfied Reincarnated asks the protagonist where he has seen a knight use a net, and then reports that even the warriors from the fishing village will not do this. The protagonist tilts his head and asks the enemy in bewilderment if he will really treat him so arrogantly. The Red Knight asks the protagonist, "What?" The protagonist tilts his head to the other side and says to the enemy, "Well, don't cry. Ask your boys to help next time." The Red Knight takes a step forward. Black and red energy circulates near Reincarnated and he shouts to the soldiers not to interfere in his duel. He moves his hand to the side and shouts that this is a direct order. The knights stood in place with weapons at the ready. Reincarnated makes a jump towards the protagonist. The knights stuck their swords into the ground. Flop looks at the knights and asks what's going on. The main character sighs and thought that the enemy bought it. The energy emanating from Reincarnated intensifies and he asks the protagonist how he dares to mock him. Black and red energy is directed towards the knight's hand. A lot of crackling energy comes from him. The main character covers himself with his hands and thought that he would never have defeated him with his current powers if he had fought him for the first time. The shadow covers part of the protagonist's helmet. The protagonist's hand is enveloped in golden energy. The Red Knight runs towards the main character, holding a shield in one hand and a sword in the other. The protagonist moves his hand with the net back. He throws a net at his enemy. The Red Knight swings his sword and calls the protagonist mediocrity. He hits the main character's net. The net covered the Red Knight. Smoke comes from him and he notices that this net is covered with holy water. The protagonist takes off his helmet and tells the enemy that the rope is still soaked in holy water and silver. The Red Knight tries to remove the net from himself and calls the protagonist a scoundrel. The main character asks the enemy if he would fight honestly when lives are at stake. The protagonist holds his helmet in his hand. The protagonist smiles and says that he must live. He looks at his enemy and says that now it's his turn. Flop asks with a shocked expression if it is hands. The wind sweeps across the battlefield where the protagonist and Reborn are located. The main character looks down and thought that it was quite difficult. But the next part is not so difficult. He lifts his head and puts on a confident expression. He thought that the silver spear could not be obtained at the beginning of the game. The protagonist imagines a spear with 3 prongs and a pair of gold coins. He adds that this also applies to expensive holy water. He imagines a bottle of holy water and many gold coins. The main character thought that a beginner, following clear instructions, would not be able to get them. The protagonist thought that he was not like that at all and made a serious expression on his face. He thought that despite the huge amount of money received for defeating Deluxe, he approaches his enemy. He thought that despite the memories and abilities he received from the heroes and countless attempts to beat the game, the protagonist took a step forward. He heads closer and closer to Reborn. He thought that despite all this, the siege of the Citadel was still the most dangerous event. Smoke appears near the protagonist. He thought that, however, he did not come here unprepared. The protagonist with a stern look thought that this was a gladiatorial fight for life and death. He imagines how gladiators armed with axes and swords fight among themselves and thought that the gladiator who has a much higher chance of winning is a Reborn. He imagines a gladiator wearing a helmet and pauldron, holding a trident and a net, and then thought that using the net to restrain an opponent, the attacker impales him with the trident. The protagonist takes a fighting stance and is enveloped in golden energy. He thought that this method was even more effective against a knight who fought according to the rules. The main character strikes the enemy with a trident. Smoke emanating from the enemy floats in the air. Trapped in a net, Reborn thought that holy water and silver were his weaknesses, but this spear technique is different from the previous one. He cuts the net with a sword and shouts, asking how this is even possible. The main character smiles smugly. Another network falls on Reborn. The main character takes out another net and asks the enemy if he really thought that there would be only one net. The Red Knight thought that he had to get out of the net. The main character makes an attack with a trident on a chained knight. Reborn thought that it was not as difficult as it seemed and cuts another network. The main character throws another net and says, "No, back." The Red Knight throws his shield into the chain and thought that his shield would block this network and he would no longer be caught. Another net covers the knight and he thought that the protagonist really threw 2 nets at once instead of 1. The main character takes out another net and tells Reborn that this is not the first time he has fought with him, and the knight asks the protagonist what he means. The knight, who was emitting steam, thought that the main character purposefully came here and challenged him to a duel face to face. He recalls how the protagonist made his way through a crowd of knights, making attacks with a halberd. He remembers how the main character threw a handkerchief with a symbol, and then thought that he would now use a silver trident and holy water to finish it off. The Red Knight stands opposite the protagonist and wonders if this was all planned. An angry Reborn shouts that this is impossible, because it's just luck. He sees the protagonist running towards him with a trident at the ready, and then shouts whether this is all for the sake of mocking him. The main character swings a trident at the enemy and asks him why he doesn't just admit defeat. He makes an attack on the knight through the net. The wounded Red Knight calls the protagonist a non-entity, and then tells him that if he is a knight, then let him fight honestly with a sword in his hand. The tired protagonist thought that his stamina was running out. He adds that he still has one chance and he will not miss it. He thought that this very chance would appear now that he was angry. Reborn shouts to the protagonist that he will kill him and cuts another network. The protagonist looks at the enemy with a serious expression on his face. He throws another net at the knight, who shouts to the protagonist that he has messed with the wrong person. Shrouded in golden energy, the protagonist looks away and tells the enemy that he said that this is not the first time this has happened to him. He turns towards the knight. The Red Knight shouts that this is nonsense. He swings his sword at the protagonist and shouts at him that they have never met him before. He throws a punch, but the protagonist dodges, after which a long wave of red energy appears. The protagonist opened his eyes wide. He lands on the ground. The protagonist thought about the silver moon spear of Cadiz and his image appears above him. The protagonist swings a trident and thought that he should give it his all. He thought about strengthening the Gerbier body. The image of a bearded man appears above the protagonist. The protagonist strikes his enemy. It hits the knight's torso. Reborn fires a powerful beam of golden energy that destroys the red stone. A beam of red-black energy shoots into the sky. The Red Knight's subordinates disappear. Lemolin and Flop look at the protagonist. The beam comes from Reincarnated, who sighs. He disappears and says, "My lord." The powerful beam in front of the protagonist disappears. The main character sees a necklace with a red stone above him and says that the event in the Citadel is over. The protagonist points his hand to the necklace and says that it is a hidden artifact that can be obtained by defeating Reincarnated in one-on-one combat. He holds the necklace in his hand. He looks at the object and says that everything was for the sake of this, and then adds that in the future this trinket will be useful to him. Flop approaches the protagonist from behind and calls him by name. The protagonist turns to the man and thought that he had forgotten about him. A green glow appears in the sky. Lemolin picks up the protagonist's helmet. She sees a red-haired man walking towards the protagonist. The red-haired man shouts the protagonist's name again. He looked down. Flop grabs the protagonist by the collar and asks him what just happened. With an angry expression on his face, he asks the protagonist what he forgot in this place. The main character tells the red-haired man that he is not Hans, and the red-haired man asks, "What?" Flop tells the protagonist not to fool him and then pushes him to the ground. With a smile on his face, he asks the main character if he really thinks that he doesn't recognize him. The protagonist, who is still being held by the collar, thought that even if he told him that he was another person stuck in this body, he would not believe him. He thought that this was a real hassle and sighed with his eyes closed. Flop asks the protagonist to say something, and the protagonist swings his fist at the red-haired man. Lemolin looks at them with a surprised expression. The protagonist asks the white-haired girl to follow him, and she asks, "What?" He turns his head to her and tells her that they are leaving here, but if she wants to stay, please. The girl with a frightened expression on her face exclaims, "No, of course not. Please don't leave me." The main character looks at the girl following him with a smile on his face. He thought that now after this incident he needed to get away as soon as possible. The protagonist made a serious expression on his face and thought that after he single-handedly defeated Reincarnated, he would be followed on his heels. The protagonist and the girl leave the battlefield, leaving behind Flop lying unconscious on the ground. Ashes from the flames are directed into the sky. Someone is walking down the street of a burning city. Flop passes by the corpses of people and wolfrikins. The shadow covers the eyes of the red-haired guy and he thought that everyone in this village died. But he does not see his body here. He sees many corpses of city residents in front of him, and then suddenly thought that the protagonist is still alive. He clenches his teeth because of the pain in his shoulder. He closes one eye and exclaims, "Damn." He wonders what happened while he was passed out and what happened to Hans. The red-haired man turns his pupils to the side and says that we need to find him. He thought that he didn't know whether he was alive or dead. He sees a monster with sharp teeth attacking a girl in front of him. The red-haired man with a grim expression says that this monster is not as strong as the damned wolf he saw. The monster opens its mouth. Flop does a slash on the monster. He shows the girl a piece of paper with a portrait of Hans. He thought that he had killed countless monsters and saved many lives, but he still could not find Hans. He shows the painted portrait to the brown-haired man. Behind Flop are Lemolin and the hooded protagonist. The red-haired man remembers how he ran away from a crowd of skeletons. He thought that in the end their meeting became his #1 goal. A girl alchemist in a hat sits near the lying Flop and looks at him. The red-haired guy thought that his goal had become an obsession. He remembers showing the portrait of Hans to the alchemist. He asks himself why he is doing this, and then answers that because he is his friend. The main character stands with a trident in his hand. Flop looks at the protagonist with wide open eyes and calls him by name. He wants to say that they met again, and after that the protagonist hits him in the face. The full moon rises in the night sky. The eyes of owls are visible in the shadows. The protagonist sits by the fire with a plant in his hand. Lemolin, with a surprised expression on his face, asks the protagonist why he is burning it. The plant burns in the protagonist's hand. He says with a serious expression that this is a medicinal plant. He thought that when burned, it emits a smell that prevents the appearance of monsters. The protagonist hands the girl a plant and says that if you burn it continuously for half an hour, the effect will last about 12 hours. He tells the girl that she can take it. The fire burned even brighter. The protagonist and Lemolin sit silently by the fire. The girl apologizes to the protagonist, who asks her what she wants to say. The girl tells the protagonist that he has so much money and various weapons, and then with interest in her eyes asks him who he is. Someone is watching them from the forest. The main character tells the girl that he is an ordinary wanderer. The girl replies that the wanderers she met were different. The protagonist interrupts the girl and tells her to be quiet, after which Lemolin stops talking. The protagonist closes his eyes and feels the wind behind him. Someone in armor comes out of the shadows. Lemelin calls out to the protagonist with a wary expression on his face. The main character tells the girl to forget. Because they are already surrounded, they are here. Several warriors in armor surrounded the protagonist and the girl, who took the sword out of its sheath. The protagonist thought that everything was just like in the game. The red-haired girl takes a fighting stance and addresses the protagonist. The protagonist continues to sit in his place while the blonde man in armor notices that there is a knight with his escort, and then asks the protagonist if he is Evan, the knight-errant. The protagonist answers with seriousness in his voice that it is possible, and then asks the blonde who he will be. The blonde replies that he is the commander of the 5th Knightly Order of the Pistons, Albedo Calvin. He puts his hand to his chest and smiles when he says his name. The protagonist, with a serious expression on his face, asks the knight what will happen next and what the Pistons soldiers are going to do with him. The blonde puts his hand forward and asks the protagonist if he would mind walking with them, and the protagonist asks the blonde, why? Albedo closes his eyes and replies that he cannot say. The protagonist looks at the knight and asks what will happen if he refuses and does not go. The knight reaches out to his sword and replies that then, no matter how much he wants to, he will have to use cruder methods of persuasion. The protagonist made a dissatisfied expression on his face. He closes his eyes and says that they will not allow such an outcome and he will go anyway. The blonde man replies with a smile on his face, "Thank you for your cooperation." The main character thought that he uses the Emperor's orders as a shield and threatens him with a sword if something doesn't go the way he wants. He gets up from his seat. The protagonist thought that as expected from the Pistons knights, gangsters. He put his hand to his head and thought that they were annoying him. The main character is enveloped in a golden aura and he is preparing to take the sword out of its sheath. He looked wary. He takes his sword out of its sheath and thought that first he would attack this self-confident scoundrel. He imagines slashing Albedo. The protagonist thought that he would then kill the guy behind him using his sword skill. He imagines striking the hooded man. He thought that he would then rush in to join the others before the formation formed. He imagines himself turning towards other enemies. He sees Lemelin in front of him, whom the knights have taken hostage. The main character closes his eyes and thought that this would remain only in his thoughts, because he cannot yet use the full power of the Cadiz. The protagonist holds his hands on the sword. The blonde asks the protagonist if he wants to start resisting. The protagonist waves his hand, and then replies that he would not do anything in the world and thought that they would get by without any unnecessary problems. He looks at the white-haired girl and made an angry expression on his face. There is bewilderment on Lemelin's face. The protagonist thought that spying on them was in his plans anyway. The protagonist hits the girl on the head with the hilt of a sword. He asks the girl to grab her things, and the girl with a bruise on her head answers, yes. The blonde with a smile on his face tells the protagonist that they have prepared a carriage for him, and the main character replies, "What a surprise." "Thank you." Albedo laughs with a fake smile on his face. His gaze suddenly became stern and he thought that there was definitely an intent to kill in the protagonist. He remembers the protagonist having a destructive aura emanating from him the moment he touched his sword, and then thought that he had clearly changed his mind when he removed his hand from the sword. The protagonist stops in place. The blonde silently looks at the protagonist's back. He thought that those who trained with real weapons had a unique gait that was unique to them. He imagines a girl with a dagger, a man with 2 axes, a man with nunchucks, and also a man with a sword. He thought that it means he uses other weapons besides the sword. He thought with a wary look that even one was difficult to use, but he seemed to be able to skillfully handle several, which was impossible. He watches the protagonist and thought that he must be making a mistake because of his fatigue, otherwise this scoundrel must be a genius. Riders accompany the carriage where the protagonist and his partner are located. The main character asks Lemelin what she is afraid of. The girl holds the protagonist's hand and says that there are a lot of men here. She closes her eyes and says that she doesn't like it when there are a lot of them around her. The protagonist eats dried meat and tells the girl that he is also a guy, and then he thought that perhaps she is not talking about ordinary people, because they met Lemelin at the market where they trade slaves. The protagonist remembers how he ransomed Lemelin from a slave trader and thought that it was quite possible that before they met, she was captured and sold into slavery to other men. He thought that although Lemelin had seen other guys in the castle, she was not so intimidated and did not cling to him. The protagonist eats another piece of jerky. He thought that it seemed that she had been captured by the soldiers. He imagines how the knight grabbed Lemelin. He looks away and thinks that this time he won't let something like this happen. The full moon rises in the night sky. The protagonist looks out the window and thought that at this speed they would arrive in the morning. He says that their destination is Peasant, but before that they need to stop at one more place. The protagonist looks at one of the horsemen and says that for the knights this may be tiring. But what does he care about them at all, because for now they can rest. The protagonist and Lemelin are sleeping. Half of the girl's face is covered in shadow. She opens her eyes and thought that the protagonist is very strange, because he always speaks harshly and tries to leave her. She looks at the sleeping protagonist from whose mouth saliva is pouring. She thought that, however, he always goes towards dangers, keeps her away from them. The girl smiles when she thinks about it. The sleeping main character says, "Cursed level." The girl laid her head on the protagonist's shoulder and thought that she felt calm next to him. She thought that if he knew this, he would hate her like everyone else. She holds a blue glowing pendant in her hand. She holds it in both hands and closes her eyes. She is holding a pendant with a blue stone, from which blue energy emanates.